Okay, in this video we will be talking about U.S. foreign policy after World War I running up to World War II. So let me get slides ready. There we go. So post-war foreign affairs, or interwar foreign affairs. So again, after World War I, before World War II. So what do we see here in post-war U.S. foreign affairs? It is largely isolationist. The United States will return to dealing primarily with its own problems and isolate itself largely from Europe's problems. And Europe's problems in the 20s and the 30s are going to get really bad. We will still be involved in the Pacific because of Japan's growing power. And still involved in the Caribbean and Central America. We're sort of jumping back in time to when the Roosevelt corollary is still in effect. Right. So we're still going to be mucking about in the Pacific, still going to be in the Caribbean and in Central America, but we will be largely isolating ourselves from Europe's problems. And as those problems get worse in the 20s and 30s, we will become further and further isolated from them. Why isolationism? Let me turn my phone off. There we go. Why isolationism? One, the United States never joined the League of Nations. And so the League of Nations was largely made up of European countries and a few of the more powerful Asian countries, namely Japan and Japan. That's pretty much it. And so not joining the League of Nations made it all that much easier to ignore Europe's problems. Harding's normalcy. Remember, Warren G. Harding had talked about how it was time for America to get back to normal. Well, normal America doesn't involve itself with the internal problems of Europe. All right. So getting back to normal pretty much meant getting back to ignoring Europe's internal affairs. Okay. We're going to trade with Europe, but as far as their own internal political struggles and policies, that's their business, not ours. The fear of foreigners caused by the Red Scare. Okay. This idea that these foreigners were bringing their communism and their socialism. And so the best thing we could do is not be involved with their countries or their people at all. The Nye Committee comes later, between 1934 and 1936. And it documented the massive bank loans that had been made to Britain and France during the war. Again, about $2 billion had been loaned to Britain or France, while only loaning roughly 3 million to the Germans. It also documented the massive profits that have been made during World War I by arms dealers, manufacturers, and so on. And so it never came right out and said any particular conclusion, but a lot of Americans felt that we had been pulled into World War I so that banks wouldn't lose money and so that corporations could make more money. And so there was kind of a feeling that we had been burned by banks and corporations into spilling American blood to protect their profits. And then finally, since we brought up the bank loans issue, Britain and France were having trouble paying the loans back. It really didn't feel like they should have to. Okay. So why does Britain not want to pay their loan, or France want to pay their loans back? Well, first of all, most of that money that we had loaned Britain and France had turned around and spent that money buying stuff from the United States. And so they felt it was a little unfair that we would give them money, which they would buy stuff from us, and now we have to pay that money back. Now they have to pay that money back. Second, they felt that they had paid in blood. Again, 2 million French had died. I don't have the numbers for the British, but they felt that there was some blood equals equivalency thing. It's an argument they make, maybe shaving some of the money off, but I don't know about forgiving it all, but certainly you can make an argument for lowering it. And European manufacturing was having trouble restarting. So even after the war, Europe was still having to buy a lot of stuff from the United States. So this created a lot of anti-American feelings in Europe, which created, in retrospect, a lot, or in turnaround on that, anti-European feelings in America. Eventually, I remember Germany is still having to pay all those payments. Eventually, this whole who owes what to who, and you owe us this much, and remember, we're sending money to Germany, and Germany's using that money to pay reparations to Britain and France taking that money and paying it back to the United States. Eventually, that system collapsed. Okay, it collapsed in 1929. after the onset of the stock market crash and slow depression that begins to gobble everyone up. In 1931, Herbert Hoover negotiated a temporary suspension of payments. Hoover, recognizing that everybody's economy was kind of starting to sink, apparently except for his own, negotiated a temporary suspension of payments. Specifically by Germany. Well, Britain and France felt, well, if the Germans aren't paying us, we don't really need to pay the Americans, because this whole not making payments was America's idea. So Britain and France stopped making their payments, and that's where they definitely misread the situation. Because in 1934, Congress passed what was called the Johnson Debt Default Act, which stated that no money would be loaned to any nation who had defaulted to any American institution. So banks or the government, U.S. government, U.S. banks, U.S. Basically, if you defaulted to any American institution, you couldn't borrow money from any other American institution. So that turns off the money to Britain and France. Now that's going to have repercussions when World War II starts, because Britain is eventually going to run out of money during the first year and a half of World War II, and the United States is going to have to figure out how to support Britain despite the Johnson Debt Default Act. So that's our relationship with Britain and France and Germany. A lot of resentment, a lot of debt, a lot of you owe me this much money and I can't pay you until this guy over here pays me. And eventually the entire system collapses under the weight of the Depression, and sort of leaves relationships between the U.S. and Europe at a real low point during the 1930s. Our relationship with Japan is that we would still like to limit Japan's power as much as possible. The big problem, of course, is that Japan is a growing nation, and then it's growing and flexing its power into the Pacific, where the United States is flexing its power. And so far, we've managed to avoid direct conflict. You may recall the Taft-Katsura Treaty from Unit 1, where the U.S. got to keep the Philippines and the Japanese got to keep Korea, and they said they would stay out of each other's way. Well, there's still more desire to limit Japan's power as much as possible. And so this led in 1921 to the Five Powers Naval Treaty, which was an attempt, and a pretty good one, it worked, at armaments reduction. The five powers involved here, the U.S., Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, recognized that the naval arms race had been one of the causes of World War I. And so the idea here was to kind of cool off the arms race for the five powers' navies. What was not known until a long time later is that a group calling itself the American Black Chamber had penetrated Japan's, they had broken Japan's codes. The Black Chamber was a group founded after World War I, largely to break other nations' cryptography. It was shut down in 1929, but it did exist for about 10 years, and its greatest success was breaching Japan's communications. And so the United States was able to know how far we could push the Japanese because we were essentially reading their messages from Washington, D.C. back to Tokyo. So we knew how far we could push the Japanese before they would quit. So what do we wind up here with? Well, for 10 years, all five powers agreed to stop building battleships and aircraft carriers for 10 years. They also agreed for no further fortification of naval bases in the Pacific. Okay. Now, as for other types of ships, because again, only battleships and aircraft carriers are completely forbidden. For other types of ships, they agreed on a tonnage ratio. So for every, let me go ahead and give you the numbers here. Yes. I don't know why I'm giving you the Italians, but I'll put it up there anyway. Now what? I forgot what France was. I think Italy was 1.5. I'm not even sure if Italy had a base in the Pacific. Let me look it up. Five Powers Naval Treaty, yada, 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 Washington Conference, aggregate tons. And I'm simplifying a lot of this. Okay. the thing to really note here is, you know, we don't even need the French and the Italians, is US, Britain, and Japan. Okay, these are the three major powers of the Pacific. For every 5 tons the US builds, Britain gets to build 5 tons, but Japan only gets to build 3 tons. Privately, the Japanese referred to this as the Rolls-Royce Ford ratio. But they accepted it. And again, the United States had known how far it could push the Japanese without them splitting the whole scene. Weaknesses. Small ships could be built up. You couldn't build battleships or aircraft carriers, but you could build destroyers, you could build submarines, you could build a lot of other ships. And there are no penalties for breaking the treaty. It also, something we didn't find out till many years later, caused serious problems within Japan itself, within the relationship between Japan's political leadership and its military leadership. The Japanese, of course, saw 553 as, once again, another snub by the West. Basically, within Japan's, the way Japan is set up to run at this time, you have an emperor. And within the military, there were 2 groups. One group was pro-treaty, and one group was anti-treaty. And both of these groups began battling for the emperor. Okay. Both groups are largely naval. There is some army, Japanese army in the anti-treaty group. But for the most part, this is a battle between 2 different parts of Japan's naval forces. The anti-treaty crowd were very expansionist. They wanted Japan's empire to grow. And so obviously limits on Japan's navy would make it difficult for Japan's empire to grow. Now, the pro-treaty crowd isn't opposed to having an empire. What they're opposed to is there are 2 larger naval powers, and they don't want to get involved in a fight with Britain and the United States. Okay. So both groups want to expand their empire. It's a question of speed. Okay, how quickly do you do that? Well, what eventually happened is the anti-treaty expansionists eventually eclipsed their rivals, gained the favor of the emperor, and pushed Japan for a rapid expansion of their empire, which of course will bring them into conflict with the United States in the late 1930s, and then eventually lead to the attack on Pearl Harbor and the attempt to drive the United States from the Pacific entirely in 1941 and 1942. That may have happened anyway. Again, there's no way to tell whether the go it slow crowd would have been any different than the quick crowd. Who can tell? In Europe, a couple of things were happening in Europe to try to put World War I behind them. Not on your study guide, but I'm going to mention anyway, were the Locarno treaties that were signed in 1925. The purpose of the Locarno treaties was to bring Germany back into diplomacy. Again, Germany, having accepted defeat, had somewhat been shunned. Remember, Germany had to take responsibility for causing the war, Article 231. And so Germany had been somewhat shunned from international diplomacy. The Locarno treaties were about bringing Germany back into the diplomatic process and sort of normalizing Germany back into foreign affairs. Germany will join the League of Nations. Another good sign. The Germans are back. There'll be a number of other treaties that are signed, basically guaranteeing, Germany signs a treaty agreeing not to mess with Belgium. France signs a treaty with Poland that they'll help Poland if Germany messes about. Poland, by the way, had not existed since the 1600s. Poland was recreated after World War I, partly by carving it out of Germany. Okay, and that's something we're going to look at in our next lecture when Hitler decides he would like that section of Poland back. But the Locarno treaties were felt to being a step towards putting diplomacy back at the forefront of solving problems and hopefully preventing any further war from breaking out. There was so much optimism that in 1928, 62 nations, including Germany, signed what was called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. Under Kellogg-Briand, the people the nations who signed the treaty agreed they would not resort to war except in self-defense. Now, clearly, that did not work because in 1939, the Germans will take a bunch of prisoners to the border between Germany and Poland, dress those prisoners up in Polish military outfits, shoot them, and then claim that Poland had invaded Germany and thus Germany could fight Poland in self-defense. So clearly Kellogg-Briand will be violated both in the spirit and the letter of the law. But it did reflect the optimism. No one expected a World War II in 1928. They really thought that that the war had been so awful that nobody would ever want to go through that again. And so the Locarno treaties, Kellogg-Briand, is sort of the spirit of diplomacy and peace so that we don't have to go through what we just went through with the First World War. And finally, let's talk about Latin America. During the 1920s, the United States was still operating under the Roosevelt corollary with regards to Latin America. So basically, we would go in, we went into Nicaragua and we went into Haiti again, and I think we even went into Cuba, but wherever we felt we should go to prevent problems from starting is where we went. Towards the end of the 1920s, we began pulling back from that. And in fact, Herbert Hoover began pulling troops out of Central America during the last year and a half of his presidency. Under FDR, the United States officially announced what was called a good neighbor policy. This involved renouncing the Roosevelt corollary so the U.S. would no longer operate under the Roosevelt corollary. This is in 1934. And it would, how to put this without getting too complex. It attempted to give Latin American favored trade status on their commodities and goods by lowering the import taxes on them. Also loaning money to more Latin American nations. Let's see. Remember the old Platt Amendment, that thing where it said we could intervene in Cuba and run Cuba's policy? That's ended under the good neighbor policy. All right, and we also pull the remaining troops in Latin America out of Latin America, with the exception, of course, of Guantanamo Bay. Now, why is Roosevelt doing this? What is his reason? Again, this is in 1934. Trouble in Europe is already brewing. And so what Roosevelt wants to do, what he's hoping to do, is he wants to shore up collective security in the Western Hemisphere in case another war breaks out, right? Going back to World War I, Germany trying to get Mexico to attack the United States. Germany trying to keep the various groups in Mexico fighting with each other so that the United States would focus on that and not on the Germans. So we really don't want that again. We want, if another war breaks out, we don't want to have to deal with problems in the Western Hemisphere. And eventually, we did get a collective security agreement with the Western Hemisphere between the United States and its neighbors to the south. Remember, collective security means that if you attack one member, you attack all the members. And so we're able to get that as part of Roosevelt's good neighbor policy. All right, in our next video, we will start looking at the road to war. So we will pick up with what has been going on in Japan and Germany, and then move on from there. All righty, and I will see you in the next video.